Hello, everyone. Welcome to Welcome Change, which is Ashoka's weekly news series where we meet social entrepreneurs and we hear about what's working, what's next, and of course, the role that we all can play. I am Njideka Harry. I'm a vice president and a leadership group member here at Ashoka, where in this capacity, I lead our strategic entrepreneurship and relationships E2 network. I am also an Ashoka Fellow, and I'm so delighted to be joined today by Ashoka Fellow Stephanie Brobby, joining from London today. Stephanie was elected as an Ashoka Fellow in 2022 for her founding of Good Ancestor Movement, where she serves as founder and as chief executive officer. Before we jump in, just some quick housekeeping. Quick reminder around the format. We'll have 30 minutes here today, and Stephanie and I will chat for about 15 to 20 minutes of that time. And then we'll turn it to a few questions from the audience. So in the meantime, through our discussion, as you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. And after our 15 to 20-minute discussion, we will turn our attention also to those questions. So welcome, Stephanie. I am so happy to have you here with us today. I'm such a big fan of your work, Stephanie. I actually remember reading about your work when you were announced as a fellow and really feeling very excited about someone like yourself, your background shifting course, so to speak, to work on these important issues. For the benefit of the audience, let me give you just a quick biography of Stephanie and who she is. In September of 2021, she launched Good Ancestor Movement, which is a social purpose business which exists really to disrupt the mainstream wealth advisory industry by challenging traditional ideas about the economy, excessive wealth accumulation, as well as tax minimization. Her practice really focuses exclusively on supporting wealthy individuals and families to align their wealth with their values through a new model of wealth stewardship, which she pioneered through the Good Ancestor Movement. And she works with wealth holders really across the UK, Europe, North America to really help accelerate the transition to a just and regenerative economy by supporting them to transform their practices around wealth, tax, and redistribution. She's a social entrepreneur and Ashoka Fellow. And what I love about her work is really, she'll share a little bit about her personal journey from tax advisor for the wealthy to now advocating for decreased wealth, so to speak. And as many of you know, Ashoka Fellows, their personal journey usually drives this big change in how the world works and where it's going. So I'm really, really excited to welcome Stephanie, to welcome change today. Since we have so much ground to cover, let's dive right in right away. And so, really looking at where we are today, we are in this age of crisis where huge fortunes are being created by a tiny few. And early last year, Oxfam issued a report called The Survival of the Richest. This report demonstrated some data that over the last 10 years, the richest 1% of humanity has captured more than half of all new global wealth. And since 2020, this wealth grab by the super rich has accelerated, and the richest 1% have captured almost 2/3 of all new wealth. And this is six times more than the bottom 90% of humanity. So let me jump right in with these questions for you, Stephanie. Why is wealth inequality a threat?
Thanks so much, Njideka, and thank you for having me. It's good to be with you all. As you were reading out those stats and grounding us in the reality, I was contemplating the growing sense of urgency that I feel in the day-to-day with the multiple crises and devastation that is unfolding around the world today. And, with my fellow practitioners, we often talk about the fact that as a global community, we're living in the time of polycrisis, right? Like a cluster of related and intersecting global risks that have compounding effects such that the overall impact exceeds the sum of each part. So we're facing the very failure of our planet's ecological and economic and social systems. And, there are lots of warning signs around wealth inequality. The statistics speak for themselves. Almost 2/3 of all new wealth generated since the pandemic in 2020, which is an ongoing issue for many communities around the world, even, if it isn't for us where we find ourselves, the pandemic is still ongoing. But since 2020, almost 2/3 of new wealth accrued to the richest 1% globally. And so, that it's really interesting because that statistic shows that our systems of economy and governance have been designed to perpetuate this kind of capital flow, and that the concentration of wealth and power. And, there are other warning signs. Here in the UK, or in Europe, there was a study a couple of years ago undertaken by L'Atelier BNP Paribas, which is the independent research subsidiary of the French bank BNP Paribas. And that study found that Britain is the second most unsustainable of 36 major economies, and that there are tensions from high housing and childcare costs, coupled with wealth inequalities, which are undermining social mobility and threatening to provoke civil unrest. And, shortly after that research report was published, we had a wave of industrial action, strikes. We're seeing the very devastating impact of wealth inequality here, which ultimately, it spans centuries even, but looking back over the last 40 years and looking at the financialization of our economy, the privatization of our infrastructure, the essentials of life, energy, water. Here in the UK, again, we have a parliament. We're in the midst of election fever over here, as we had a snap general election called, and we have a parliamentary candidate who is campaigning for water to be put back into public ownership, because in parts of the country, owing to privatization, we are essentially drinking our own excrement because of failure to invest in water infrastructure. Meanwhile, 78 billion pounds worth of dividends have been paid to shareholders since water was privatized. And so wealth inequality is killing us. It's making us ill. It's making us very stressed. And we know that Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has said that we are faced with the prospect of heading back towards 19th century levels of inequality worldwide, which I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely terrifying. And I think it's an indictment on our societies, and particularly on our systems of economy and governance, which are serving the interests of very few people across a handful of geographies. And I think, the phrase that I keep repeating that I would really like to socialize in our discourse is that extreme wealth is a public health issue. It's not just something that economic justice campaigners are talking about, but it is a public health issue.
Thanks for that background and context, Stephanie. I totally, just as you said, I mean, this is really an urgent matter, right? It's a matter of urgency. I think, you described the water privatization matter as really a public health issue, and looking at how do we kind of reallocate those resources, so that everyone has power, everyone can get access to those resources. So certainly excellent points that you mentioned there. So your organization, Good Ancestor Movement, works really on this regenerative future, right? That is just, that is equitable, and that recognizes and repairs, I guess you can describe it as the harm that has been done to communities around the world and our ecology. And you've done that quite successfully over the last couple of years. I also realize that a lot of what you described and some of the examples and the statistics that you talk about reflect on, the systems of the economy, which you described, which are which can be described as extractive, right? But these systems didn't fall in place by themselves. They were created. And so how and in what ways do organizations like yours and others look at really, taking those extractive systems and building more sustainable systems around that? So what you do, Stephanie, in your organization, if you can think about what to you is the most effective way for high net worth individuals to utilize their resources for good, how would you describe that? Um, are there, ways in which you think traditional philanthropy may be looked at a little bit differently? Or how would you look at the system of extraction that we have currently and solve it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably best to explain this in the context of our praxis at GAM, at the Good Ancestor Movement. Our mission is to accelerate the just transition to a regenerative economy. And really what we've done is, with the skills and experience that I have as a former recovering private wealth lawyer, and now emergent financial activist, is really to identify this very strategic intervention point whereby we can organize wealthy individuals who have a social justice orientation, who care about equity, who care about seeing repair, and about targeting the root causes of the degradation and chaos that we are seeing in our systems of economy and governance and in our societies. So we've identified a very strategic leverage point there, which is to support wealthy individuals who have more wealth than they need, to actually start moving their capital out of the extractive economy where it sits, typically in a very speculative manner in traditional financial markets and real estate markets, and to actually start moving capital into communities and social movements, folks who are on the front lines of the harm of the extractive economy, the harm that's inflicted by our economic system, who are already developing their own responses to the social and ecological crises that we face. And so that's really our work, our praxis. It's very much within the context of the strategy framework for a just transition, which was developed by Movement Generation and the Climate Justice Alliance. And that kind of maps out this political analysis in which our work is anchored. And you've already talked about the extractive economy that we have that's rooted in exploitation and the unsustainable extraction of natural resources, and is very much geared up towards the accumulation of wealth and power. Encourage your people that are listening to look at the strategy framework for a just transition. It also paints this wonderful vision of a regenerative economy, which I think to some people feels very lofty and idealistic. And I'm very mindful of the fact that we seem to be in a perpetual state of crisis of imagination, and really recognizing how important it is for us to be bold and visionary as we work towards equitable and regenerative futures for all. And so, a regenerative economy, Kate Raworth, if you haven't read Donut Economics, she really gave us the gift of Donut Economics, which is a compass for 21st century economics, and she talks about meeting the needs of humanity within planetary boundaries and building a regenerative economy that is distributive and regenerative by design. And so this regenerative economy requires us to rethink our relationship to resources and to each other, and to think about the structures of ownership that we have, and to really ensure that communities that have been dispossessed and displaced because of the extractive economic system that we have access to capital that they need in order to build the new structures and systems that will support the economy of the future, and to help shift the purpose of the economy from the accumulation of wealth and power to the well-being of our life-sustaining planetary systems and our global communities. And so really our practices with clients involve helping them to direct capital into communities. And, obviously, we have to embrace paradox. We have a critique of philanthropy, of course, because we know that philanthropy exists as a byproduct of the extractive economic system that we have. Some people are able to accumulate vast amounts of wealth at the expense of others. And then they can choose to redistribute some or all of that wealth. And as much as philanthropy can do some fantastic things and can accelerate solutions, we mustn't lose our critique of philanthropy as a system, as a byproduct of an extractive economic system. That being said, there is an incredible opportunity for wealthy individuals who have more than they need to make catalytic grants to people that are organizing across communities and social movements, but also to think about asset transfer, right, of looking at capital assets and how they can be transferred into community ownership, and community-led and governed, so that power is shifted. And I think this is something that's often really difficult for people to absorb fully, that we're interested in redistributing wealth and shifting power back into communities who have been harmed, who have been disenfranchised and marginalized from making decisions about, that really affect them. We want to really empower communities, people on the front lines, to have decision-making power over their resources and over their futures, so that they can enjoy sovereignty and self-determination.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's brilliant in the way you described what your organization does, and really your mission on really around, moving towards a more regenerative economy. I'd like to just come back with one short question there about when you think about the definition of wealth, right? I know many people may think about just financial and maybe assets, right? But also we think about wealth in terms of social capital as well as cultural capital. I remember one of your pieces kind of highlighting that perspective as well. And your organization, really, it's thinking around, it doesn't matter how much impact investments or even philanthropy that you do. It's, if we continue to accumulate more than we need, in essence, it may not get us, or it won't get us to where we need to be. So this whole mentality of, traditional philanthropy or impact investments may need to be revisited, so that we are really working towards, like you described, a more equitable and just world for everyone. So thank you for that preface as well. And then my final question to you, Stephanie, is really, when we look at utilizing their resources for good, can you maybe share with us some concrete examples of, ways in which you envision these high net worth individuals and or entrepreneurs actually working with some of these groups you've described, some of these leaders that are proximate, right, to the communities and to the problems that they are trying to solve. Do you have maybe any examples you can share with us where you've seen a good amount of success with that?
Sure. I mean, just to speak to Good Ancestor Movement's praxis again, we are in the process of launching our first resourcing vehicle. It's called Catalytic Collective. And that's an initiative that is collectivizing wealth holders around an annual pledge to redistribute into a collective pool of funds, which will then be overseen by an accountability circle, which comprises leaders from community organizing and kind of movement leaders, people that are really rooted in grassroots organizations, rooted in their communities. They may not be organizations, they may be in collectives or other unconstituted formations, but have the lived experience of being rooted on the front lines of communities, and therefore best placed to have decision-making power over how resources are redistributed. So that's an emergent and growing community, and we're starting in the UK. So if anyone hears about that and is based in the UK, they're most welcome to get in touch and to find out more about how they can participate and engage in the practice of redistributing wealth and power in a community. I'm thinking about other folks that I'm in relationship with that I continue to learn from and strategize with, thinking about people at Solidaire, the Solidaire network, and Good Life Pledge, which is well, Solidaire. I'm sure many people will have heard of, but a fantastic community that has a number of different pooled funds, from pledges from their membership, with a real focus on resourcing social movements, an incredibly powerful network. And then the Good Life Pledge, which is supporting wealth holders to build relationship with community-led organizations who are ready to receive kind of asset transfer. So it could be transferring, financial assets or real estate, and really focusing on ensuring that communities can be rooted in their communities through community ownership, and really, I think there's again, we focus so much on redistributing the wealth, but so much of this work is about healing relationships, healing our relationship to each other and to the planet. So to these communities, I really believe are places where wealthy individuals can engage in the practice of redistribution, but also learn alongside those who are doing the work of bringing about the new system that we need.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Stephanie. And the great examples you provided. We're really excited about the Catalytic Collective, like you've described, that will be released here shortly with GAM. So we will be on the lookout for that. I could think very quickly about several high net worth and high impact entrepreneurs within our network at Ashoka that would love to learn a little bit more about that and how they can invest in those social leaders working at proximate view to some of these issues as well. So thank you for sharing that. We have so many great questions, Stephanie. I can go on in conversation with you for days because this is a topic that I am truly, truly passionate about. And you've done such a fantastic job rooting us in the context and the work that you do with your organization. So thank you for that. Let me just take a moment to ask you some of these questions coming through the chat. So Stephanie, one of the questions is really, Hillary is asking about if you would call this work that you do, if it's kind of impact investing. If not, can you explain the difference? I think you've covered that a little bit, but there was one sentence you could just provide to Hillary as a distinct difference between the work you do and impact investing with some of these high net worth clients.
Sure. I mean, I haven't actually talked about our emergent transformative investment practice, but which is seeking to support what we call non-extractive investment from. So really, the mindset that underpins that kind of investment is wealth holders with surplus capital beginning to see that their capital should be used as a tool to absorb risk rather than something that should continue accumulating wealth, should keep growing. And I think that people would often say, well, I'm not looking for, market rate returns, and this is impact investing. But actually, what we see operationalized and a lot of the language and the practices involved in mainstream impact investing doesn't match that. There's an incongruence. And I think it was either this year or last year, I think impact investment hit kind of $1 trillion under management. And yet here we are. I'm sure impact investment has done some good for the world, and it hasn't gone to the lengths that we need it to really disrupt the structural inequalities and dynamics that are present in our economic system. And ultimately, many of the organizations, collectives, communities around the world don't have access to the capital that they need on the terms that they need. It's still very extractive. It's still giving on the one hand and taking on the other. And so I would say many of our practices are about reimagining the relationship to investment and reimagining our relationship to risk, and enabling, providing capital to enable communities to invest for themselves on their own terms. That coming back to that piece around self-determination and sovereignty that I was talking about, we released a report called Resourcing the Solidarity Economy, which was a collaboration with our movement partners, Decolonizing Economics, who are working to build a solidarity economy rooted in racial justice principles. I'm happy to share a link to that report, which will tell you more about kind of the rationale behind how we have decided to approach our resourcing strategy, which prioritizes non-repayable finance to the communities that we're seeking to resource, but identifies scope for investment or repayable finance within certain parameters. But there are many examples of different types of reimagined impact investing. I'm thinking about the Katali Foundation's Restorative Economies Fund, which is a brilliant example of using integrated capital, the coordinated use of financial and non-financial capital to resource communities that are seeking to build economic, cultural, political power. So those are some of my recommendations. And of course, this is something that is still very emergent in our work, but something that ultimately we're seeking to develop and support.
Great, thank you. And a link to that report that you mentioned, your report, will be shared on the channel afterwards if it's not here already. So thank you. I know we have maybe room for just one more question. And if we can just address this, is education the most urgent and critical aspect to move the needle? Wealthy individuals may reject being part of the extractive economy, right? What would be an effective message, Stephanie, for them to produce change? And so that question is coming from Lewis.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Lewis. Education is really the foundation of our, the baseline in terms of our engagement with wealth holders when they come to us. We run a program called Reimagining Wealth. We call it a crash course in political economy for wealth holders, and it enables them to essentially what we do is to retell the story of our economy in a way that includes many of the narratives that have been erased, right? So there's one way to talk about how the West became great, and you could say that the West became great and rich because of the three revolutions of science and technology and politics. This is what Kehinde Andrews says in his book, The New Age of Empire. Or you can talk about, ecocide, genocide, transatlantic slavery, colonialism, much of which still goes on today. But these are inconvenient truths. And so we take an approach that is very compassion-led and really supporting people to understand this is the economy that we've inherited, and these are the things that we haven't been told. And these are the implications for your wealth and your participation in the economy at the level at which you sit. And this is another way to be in the world, to introducing them to the just transition framework and the opportunities that they have to play their part in resourcing the next economy. So education is absolutely foundational.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. We need to really start telling the whole story, right, about wealth and where it comes from, to start to really deliver the facts, and to really hone in to access things like, like we found a narrative to talk about growth and this obsession we have about growth when we live on a planet, I guess, with finite resources. So this has been such a wonderful conversation, and I hate that 30 minutes is never enough, but certainly really, really appreciate your time with us today, Stephanie. This seems like a good place to stop. A huge thanks to you, Stephanie, and your team. What a pleasure it has been to be here with you today discussing this very, very important topic and helping us see ahead. So thank you. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us today, for your great questions. Please be on the lookout for an email with a link to today's conversation, which you can revisit, and of course you can share. And please enjoy the rest of your evening, your day, your morning. And to everyone, see you next week at Welcome Change. Thank you.